Good, we're good.
Thank you. So let me start, of course, with making the honors and thanking Pablo and Izaskun and everyone here in the group in Pamplona, and of course, thanking the Plexus project and all the people that are members of the project and the institutions that make the project, and of course the European Union for supporting this. I've been staying in Torino, working with Martina for a couple of weeks, and of course we've been receiving Buenos Aires people from the project all over this time, and it's been amazing, and I cannot thank you enough for all of that. I hope to contribute to the project in a special way in this opportunity, giving you what I think is an interesting perspective on basically, well, the topic of the project, which is radical substructurality or substructural logics. But I think that we have been using the term in the project, or in some of the groups of the project, or in some of the research venues of the groups of the project in a very specific way, which actually cannot be found in the literature yet. But it's more or less there, and you will see in the end, on Friday, that actually there is a nice support for that attempt. And in fact, that the attempt is pretty obvious, but it hasn't been articulated. And the attempt or the conception that I'm going to propose will be, of course, called parastructurality. And actually, it's just a cumbersome name for a phenomenon that you will probably understand very nicely, okay? So what we will do during these 5 days is I will review sort of the literature on the topics that the project is about, and each class I will try to do something in particular. We will have some philosophical stuff, we will have some formal stuff, maybe we will be able to do some exercises live, okay, here. And I'm not thinking about giving you homework, but probably if some of you are interested in some stuff, we can just put an asterisk on that and pick on that the next day, for example, if some of you reviewed bibliography and want to bring something, etc. Okay? Before going into that, I just wanted to get a better reading of the room, okay, in terms of the students, which are more important to me. So I know that some of you come from psychology, right? Yeah. Okay. And anyone else doesn't come from logic or philosophy or mathematics? No, all of you come from one or another. Okay, good. But I assume that some of you, for example, have done like logical work in, say, propositional logics or predicate logics, perhaps only semantically or perhaps only proof theoretically. So I wanted to know whether some of you only work with proof theory, for example, and have no understanding of logical matrices, which is completely fine, but just for me to know whether or not I have to do that. Some of you have only done proof theory? Elaine, yeah. Well,
I know what a matrix is.
Yeah, good. And some of you, perhaps more commonly, only work with semantics. So did some of you not work with sequent calculus and doing, intense proof in sequent calculus? Good. Okay, because good. Because maybe I can just emphasize some stuff. We can show you some stuff in the board, etc. Like I will comment on some completeness proofs and sometimes, and we will see some techniques. And then what else? Yes, and I wanted to know also, like, where some I assume that some of you come from some interest and some of you come from other interests. For example, have any of you did some of you not encounter, for example, bibliography on vagueness? So that can be a thing, right? Okay, so because there is a lot of specific thing in terms of tolerance principles, the paradoxes of Sorites, which are super specific, right? And also there is this stuff about theories of truth, axiomatic. So maybe some of you didn't. work with that, paradoxes, more or less. Okay, good. Because there are also, well, the project has a lot of people working on that, but also some people that didn't come from that literature, but from other literature, right? From the more computer science-minded, say, approach to substructurality. Good. So if at some point I say like, oh yes, this is pertaining to naive theories of truth, maybe I will take into account that some of you don't know exactly what it is, and I will zoom in, okay? I hope it doesn't bother the others. Good. Let's get into it. So, as I said, this is a link, and let's now tell you what my aim is with this course. So, it is a very... my aim here is an aim that tries to contribute to the whole endeavor of the Plexus project in trying to enrich the classification of logical systems that we are playing with, using, analyzing, studying in the project. So, of course, we are trying to study substructural logics, and they are supposed to be different to structural logics, which sometimes are also referred to as Tarskian logics, okay? We will see that that is not exactly the case. That separation is not the proper separation, okay? And of course we will discuss that in detail. And we will also discuss this new meaning of substructurality or parastructurality. And so I want to enrich these classifications of logic that are Tarskian, non-Tarskian, substructural or structural, and parastructural or not parastructural, basically, and show you that all of these are different, right? So maybe I have it here. Yeah, so I give you an overview of these things today, and we will discuss some things in particular, and at some point we will make a toilet break. But in the next discussions, in the next classes, the next meetings, I'll argue actually for the three next claims. Substructural logics are not non-Tarskian logics, so these two things are different. That will be tomorrow. Non-Tarskian logics are not the same as parastructural logics, so the sense in which we talk, many of us within the project thought about substructural logics is not this. And again, so for the last act, substructural logics are not parastructural logics. So the sense in which we are talking about substructurality within the project is not the sense in which the literature talks about substructurality. Okay, so we need to better understand that. In the end, you will see everything is super intelligible, everything is super understandable, and you can pretty much understand what is this class, and what is that, and there will be no difference. But you will see that sometimes when you were reading stuff and people were saying, okay, this is substructural, they were actually meaning parastructural, and when they were saying, okay, this is Tarskian, they were saying, this is actually parastructural, and so on and so forth, okay? Actually, they were saying, and by they I mean some people in this room, this is Tarskian, but you can enrich the language and have a substructural. They were actually saying this is parastructural, okay? All of this, I hope, will become clear in the next meetings, but we'll see, okay? So let's start with the first overview of these items that we will analyze, and it is Tarskian logics, okay? Perhaps many of you know this, but I think it's, since the contribution of this course is to make a more nuanced classification, it's super important to get into the finest of the details in these definitions, okay? So Tarskian logics, how do we come to them as a sort of a community in terms of a consolidated, research paradigm, okay? So, at some point in the history of logic, actually let's say at the start of the previous century, we were actually focused on axiomatic systems, and in doing so, we were individuating logics by focusing on their set of theorems or logical truths, okay? We were not actually very interested in inferences. We were interested in what are the logical truths, what are the theorems of a logic, what are the things that a logic, say, asserts, okay? So we used to do that, and the many important works on logics in the previous century, Principia Mathematica, etc., were focused on that, on axiomatic systems. But at some point, it became clear, either from the point of view of a deeper understanding of logical consequence in terms of model theory and Tarski's investigations and the Polish school around the 30s and the 40s, and later also showing in parallel that there is a possibility of arriving at the same set of theorems that classical logic has, but having actually a different logic in a sense that needed to be specified, that actually that was a very narrow definition, okay? Because you can have systems that are not classical logic in a sense to be specified, okay? But they have the same theorems. So individuating a logic by its set of theorems was probably something that was short-sighted, okay? So for example, in the case of the logic of paradox, many of you might know this, it is a logic, and we will analyze it in later classes. It is a logic that has the same theorems as classical logic, but it invalidates modus ponens. So if we are only focusing on the theorems, there's no difference. So the thing is, maybe this brings to the fore the fact that we need a formal distinction to see these two systems as different, okay? And here comes the Tarskian approach, okay? Which doesn't only focus on theorems or in valid statements, valid sentences, okay? So the Tarskian conception doesn't equate or individuate a logic by its set of theorems or valid sentences, or tautologies, if you want, but by its set of inferences. And actually, it only catalogs logics as sets of inferences that have certain features, okay? So as logics are developed, it will become clear that actually the same phenomenon that we had before, where we had logics that share the same theorems between a classical and a non-classical one, this will also happen for the Tarskian paradigm, where you will have also logics that will have the same inferential validities than classical logic, but will be different. And in fact, I assume many of you know the work by Pablo and collaborators, where they introduce this logic called ST, or strict tolerant logic, which is intended to show that you can have the same inferences as classical logic, but in a way be different than classical logic, okay? So being a different logic. So my point here, and perhaps the thing that we have been circling around for a decade long now or more, is that maybe some conceptual and formal distinctions need to be introduced. And such will be the potential utility, right, or the fruitfulness of what I will call the parastructural approach, which is more or less what has been intuitively underlying our discussion and our disagreements around these papers, where someone says, this logic is classical logic, and we say, well, not necessarily, because classical logic doesn't have this and that, and this logic has this and that, or the other way around. Classical logic has that, but this one doesn't. So how do we tell them apart? Okay, so now that we know why we arrive at this, let's have a closer look into Tarskianity. Okay, so logical systems over a language, that is super important, are pairs where this, of a language, right, and a consequence relation, where this consequence relation is a relation, right, is Tarskian, and that will mean that it has the following properties. And by saying that it is a relation, we mean that it actually has pairs where we have possibly multiple premises on the left and a single conclusion on the right, okay? This is actually how Tarski came about defining a logic, so with single conclusions, but we will see, of course, there are nuances here. Here we have a property of reflexivity, which basically says that from a set of assumptions you can derive any of them. This is a very generalized notion of reflexivity because you can have many assumptions besides that one that you are inferring. So you can possibly also require that this is exactly phi. Okay, we'll see. Here we have monotonicity, which says that if something is valid in the logic, then enlarging the set of premises cannot account for its invalidity. Okay, you can add premises and validity notwithstanding. Okay, and then transitivity, here formulated in a very special way, says that if from gamma you infer something, and from a certain delta you can actually infer every member of gamma, then from that delta you can infer your first conclusion. Because basically you go through delta, you get all the gammas, and then you go to phi. So you can concatenate that reasoning. And finally, super important, we have this property of substitution invariance, okay? Which for some encodes or codifies the fact that logic is formal, right? That it is not, that validity is not connected or dependent on the content of the proposition being discussed or the specific proposition being used in that case, but it is rather formal, okay? So,
Two questions.
Sí.
So I assume that the idea that gamma, delta, pi are sets of formulas is part of the Tarskian.
Well, here I say collections because Tarski is talking about sets, but we will see that we can have Tarskian consequence relations even if we don't assume that they are sets. Okay. But we need to...
You don't want to include...
Exactly, but you can say that. I just put collection here because I will talk about ways of being non-Tarskian, but there are ways of being Tarskian even not assuming sets.
And the sets of collections are finite.
Right, and they can be infinite. There's nothing assumed here because whenever you have a valid inference, you have that the set of premises, if it is valid, there is a subset which is finite that entails that same thing. You assume finitariness.
Yeah, I'm talking about transitivity, right? I mean, because you have to test everything for everything.
Right.
And you have an infinite number of things to
right.
test.
You might.
It doesn't matter if it has the finite property or not. I mean, you have to.
Yeah.
You have to.
Yeah.
You need,
Right. So,
you need a logic. I mean, you need a logic that's actually compact for that. I mean, to assume that you have a finite set, if you going from an infinite set to a finite set, you first need to prove that it's compact.
absolutely.
Right?
So
And the Tarskian notion doesn't actually
Absolutely.
require the set to be finite.
exactly, that's what I meant. So this is a Tarskian consequence relation or a Tarskian logic. If you have that property, you have a finitary Tarskian logic. If you don't, you don't. And of course, this allows for both things. There will be some things that I will mention just shortly that appeal to the fact that it has to be finite. And of course, we will not discuss the full theory of finite or non-finitary Tarskian logics, but know that there are some things that depend on that, some results that depend on that, and some results that don't use that. So it's very interesting that yes, Pablo.
Yeah, and the more specific version of reflexivity that phi implies phi is not equivalent to the more general on the presence of monotonicity?
Well, this one is the one that you will find everywhere, but interestingly enough, it has some sort of monotonicity built in, right? So I wanted also to flag that when I mentioned the more, let's say, refined notion of reflexivity doesn't entail a very specific notion of monotonicity, which is where you can enlarge instances of reflexivity, say. So that is a very specific instance of monotonicity.
My intuition is that in a very general way, the specific form will imply the more general form if you have the monotonicity. So phi implies phi. With this idea of monotonicity will give you the more general form.
Yeah. But this one won't entail this.
No.
So that is a very interesting thing.
Okay.
But there is something else as well, as I put in my slides.
Sí.
So if you take off monotonicity,
Sí.
and you still have the reflexivity like this,
Sí.
then it's the same as having monotonicity as well. You can get back to monotonicity.
Really?
But
Yes.
it depends on exactly how are you formulating, because are you working with sets, with
Yeah,
collections?
so if they are sets, then you can do
Yeah,
it.
if
So
they are
you can-
sets-
you can come back to monotonicity.
Yeah. But that depends. Here we are talking abstractly, right? We're not talking about semantics, not talking about proof theory. We're only talking about sets of relations, right?
Whatever. Yes.
So, and we don't even know what are these collections. We don't know if they are sets, lists, sequences, and multisets.
And it's many to one. This is
Right,
also important.
right.
I mean,
So it's not obvious that from this you can get that for all collections, because they can be very
yeah,
weird
if you're in
behaving.
sets, then
Right. But if you're in sets, yes. But if not, so here you see there will be a lot of different things going on. Okay? So let's move on a little bit. And I wanted, especially probably for some students, to flag the fact that structurality is also mentioned in the literature about logics in a different way, perhaps a rather old way in terms of, or a past way, where some in the Polish tradition, more than anything, used to refer to structurality as a substitution invariance of rules and of course logics, okay? So when you may find structurality refer to logics and to rules, saying that they are actually substitution invariant or formal, right? But nowadays we come to identify this with a more neutral term, substitution invariance, okay? Or invariant under endomorphisms, right? But just wanted to flag that because some of you might do research, try to look for some things in Google Scholar, and it's important to know that some other people use this in some other ways, right? Okay. And now, substitution invariance is, I think it's pretty common to assume that it is a part of the property of being Tarskian, okay? Okay. Finally, I guess regarding Tarskianity, let's observe that there is an asymmetry between the amount of premises, the possible amount of premises, and the possible amount of conclusions, okay? These are allowed to be many. This is required to be only one, right? So this asymmetry is a sort of very essential to the Tarskian tradition, but of course can be further pushed and generalized, okay? And there are actually at least two different ways to go in order to, let's say, recompose this symmetry and allow for many things also, for possibly many things also on the right or on the side of the conclusions. One of them, perhaps this will be of interest for some of you that are working in one of these traditions but don't know the other, or the other way around. One of them is very keen to the philosophical side, let's say, the more philosophy of logic side. And the other one is more close to the mathematical community. And actually, I've encountered that some people in the mathematical community, super knowledgeable about a lot of things, are not really familiar with the philosophical side of this, and the other way around too, okay? So what they do in the philosophical community, more or less, of course not all of them, and actually we have colleagues in Buenos Aires that are opposing this, and also over Europe, they tend to favor the fact that if you allow for multiple conclusions, say gamma, the set of the inference from the set of premises gamma to the set of conclusions delta is supposed to mean what? The philosophers tend to say that gamma entails some of the deltas, so at least one. Okay, and this is what we call the disjunctive reading of multiple conclusions. Okay, good. And the folks in the more mathematical side tend to say something which is dual to that. So gamma entails the deltas, even if it entails all of the deltas. So it's a conjunctive reading, okay? And you can find it, for example, in the literature on abstract algebraic logic. Of course, one of the reference texts there is the now not so recent abstract algebraic logic text by Josep Maria Font, okay? That you can find in college publications. I completely recommend this book, and maybe, surprise for the people that are going to be in Buenos Aires, maybe I'll organize a reading group for that while you're there, okay? So we can read the book, and maybe we'll do it by Zoom so other people can. Okay, and here I put a reference by Florian Steinberger, because he's one philosopher who actually rejects the philosophical tradition, and he says that the philosopher's tendency, or let's say custom, to embrace the disjunctive reading, he actually doesn't like it. He thinks it is misguided and it's not grounded in anything that is reasonable, philosophically or conceptually speaking. It doesn't make sense to speak about disjunctive conclusions, or there are no instances in the everyday discourse that will support this way of approaching things. And interestingly, the conjunctive reading, granted some assumptions, is actually equivalent, granted some assumptions, with the single conclusion. Okay, so maybe that's in favor of the conjunctive. Okay, I will let this for you to decide. Maybe some of you will discuss it at some point, maybe not. But I just wanted to have like a common ground. Okay, with this regard. Okay, now moving from the super, let's say, general or abstract or agnostic way of approaching Tarskian logics to the more particular ways, which of course you have discussed and studied, because I want to set the table for the Tarskian logics in order to then be able in the next classes to analyze properly and close substructural and parastructural, okay? And of course non-Tarskian. So what I will say, and I think that's a very reasonable statement, is that there are at least two formal routes to induce a logic, okay? Via calculus or via a semantic, okay? Maybe there are more ways. I'm not claiming that these are the only ways, but at least these two ways. And of course, there are some people who oppose the fact that these are two different ways, because they say that the rule or the calculus way of approaching a logic is actually giving a semantic for that. And some of you, maybe coming from philosophy, will be familiar with the work by Wittgenstein and the people coming after Wittgenstein, the idea that meaning is used, the rules, the community, etc. Some logicians and philosophers of logic have said that, okay, if the meaning is given by use and use is formalized by the rules, actually the rules are giving the meaning. So if semantics is a theory of meaning, then calculus is semantics. Okay, this is a very idiosyncratic way of approaching it, but I just wanted to let you know that this exists, and there's actually a lot of people in this community of proof-theoretic semantics that really want to push this, and I don't think that this doesn't have merits, so I wanted to mention that, okay?
There are people
see?
here doing PTS, so
Exactly.
Be careful.
I'm not trying to insult anyone here. And actually, sometimes the other way around too, right? Some instrument that some people will say, oh, they are super semantic, some people will say, no, that is a proper calculus. For example, tableaus, right? Or label tableaus, or n-sided sequence calculus. Some may say, this looks exactly like a truth table, but just operationalized. No, this is a calculus. You have signs, you interpret them with rules. There's nothing semantic there. Super syntactic. So I think these discussions are interesting, and just for students, I think it's nice to comment the fact that they exist, okay? Good. Let's go first into calculus, okay? Wanted to set the table here. Of course, we're going to focus on some of these instructions, or some of these ways, not because they are superior, but because they are actually more entrenched with what we are doing in the project. So I think that with regard to the project of Plexus, we will definitely be discussing sequence calculus, okay? There are some ways of discussing substructural logics also in this calculus, but I will not be commenting on them. We can discuss them if you want, and we can do that later. So some types of calculus that are very friendly to be interpreted as establishing the validity of an inference, so really keen to the Tarskian framework: natural deduction, tableau, sequence calculus, and variance. So hypersequence, n-sided sequence, etc., etc. I'm not putting axiomatic systems here because they are not very helpful with the Tarskian approach. They are super helpful with establishing a set of logical truths, but if you are using an axiomatic system for establishing a Tarskian logic, you probably need to tweak some of your definitions and say, okay, if I have proof of this, I have proof of that, or something like that. Or if I assume this and I use this as additional axioms, etc. Good. And actually, to be honest, sequence calculus are axiomatic systems. So we'll see, right? So special kinds of axiomatic systems, but we'll see. So Elaine already introduced us to these. But here's a deduction calculus for classical logic, in Fitch style at least. But you're already familiar with this, so I don't need to go into the details because we already have seen that. Now, for the semantics, there are many semantic ways which are friendly to the Tarskian approach, right? The one that I like the most, but this is my bias, is matrix semantics, right? And you can look at that in Font's book, of course, and in many works by a lot of people. You have creepy frames, you have other intentional ways of describing logics. You can look at many of these in the textbook by Priest, An Introduction to Non-Classical Logic, which is very nice. I don't know if, Pablo, in your book, they are also commented the frames? No. Only truth table stuff, or
you mean
in the new one?
I comment a little bit on global semantics.
Perfect.
And not particular discussions on frames.
See, but a little bit of intuitionistic logic? No. Okay. So maybe Priest and other textbooks have a discussion of intuitionistic logic, which is done by Kripke frames, special kind of Kripke frames, and so on. So if you're interested, you can see that, and they are all ways of arriving at Tarskian logic. Okay, so first look at what we will be discussing a lot during this course, matrix semantics, okay? This is actually a very convoluted way of saying what you all know very, very well, right? Which is, you have a set of truth tables for a language, and you have a consequence relation, which is basically, if the premises are this, then the conclusion should be that. And this and that are usually the same. So, in logic 1, truth. Okay? If the premises are true, then the conclusion should be true, necessarily for evaluations. Okay? So, in the terminology or the nomenclature of logical matrices and abstract algebraic logic, what we say is we have an object, which is called a logical matrix, which is a pair that on the left has an algebra that interprets all the connectives in the language that we are trying to endow a semantics with. all of them and only them, so it doesn't have more operations. So it's the type of the language is the same as the type of the algebra. That's how we express that formally. And here we have a designated set, a set that is distinguished from the others, which is actually a subset of the universe of this algebra, basically of the elements that algebra is playing with. And what you usually do is, if you have a finite algebra, you display this operation in your truth tables. So this is a very, convoluted and very formal way of saying truth tables and a designated set of truth values. What you do is you end up with a consequent relation that is Tarskian. So, for example, so these are actually, yes. So what you have here is this two-element Boolean algebra. That's why the B is placed here, okay? True and false, and you know how this operation works. Negation flip-flops truth and falsity. Conjunction is true if and only if both are true, and disjunction is true if and only if some of them are true, and false otherwise in the other cases. And consequence relation is preservation of truth, okay? Good. So we've seen examples of calculus, examples of semantics. How close are these things related? So Tarskian logics and the things that we commented on. So as far as I know, and I'm more knowledgeable about the semantic side and the proof theoretic side in terms of the functionality of it. Tarskian logics and logical matrices, so structures where you have an algebra here and a set of designated values, they are very related in terms, in the following terms of, for every Tarskian logic, there's a possibly infinite class of logical matrices that characterizes it. So basically, if you have a logic, right? Let's call it L, right? For that logic, there is a class ML, which is equal to a set of matrices M1, Mn, and then it might go on infinitely, right? Or not, such that an inference is valid here if and only if it's valid in all of them. So it preserves designated value in all of them. This class might be infinite or might not, okay? More interesting cases are the ones where this is finite, you know very well what it is, and it's super clear. Yes, I can.
Is your M here designating all the models of the logic, or is it all the matrices that will generate exactly the set of inferences you want? Because, for instance, if you take like a Boolean logic, it will be a model for a De Morgan algebra, but
right.
I mean that both won't give you the same.
No, here you are actually no, you are trying to get at well, in the best case, you are trying to get at the minimal set of matrices such that validity here is characterized exactly by validity there, right? There are a lot of other notions in and around the theory of the association of logical matrices and logics, Tarskian logics, in terms of the algebraic models, the reduced models, etc., etc., etc. We can learn about that when we do the font reading group, because there are a lot of things to learn about that. But this is the more, say, restricted result, right? Basically, what you would like to do, hopefully, is for a logic there is a matrix. That's not the case. Not always. Not always validity for your logic can be expressed by a single logical matrix, by preservation of designated value from here to there. Let's say preservation of truth in a specific set of truth tables. Sometimes you need more than one matrix, and that can do the trick. And sometimes you need infinitely many of them. See?
So
I have two questions.
Si.
So the precise definition of a matrix is an individual algebra
Right.
and a set of designated values?
Sí.
Okay. And the second question was, is ML guaranteed that it can be countable?
Sorry.
It might be infinitely many.
Right.
Is it
And
guaranteed to be countable?
each of the, yeah, they're going to be countable, yes. But
Okay.
each of them can also be infinite.
Yes. Okay.
Right.
I see.
Yeah. And then there is also a question about, well, so there is this connection between logical matrices and Tarskian logics. And of course, since Tarskian logics, like we were discussing with Elaine and Claudia, they are very general, right? I will need probably to review a little bit more these results, not this result, but the results around the connection between some calculi and Tarskian logics, and if some of you know, let me know, but basically finitary Tarskian logics and sequent calculi, which we will discuss very shortly, have the following connection. For every finitary logic that also may have some properties regarding the connectives or not, I can refer you to the result in Font's textbook. The logic has a sequent calculus. So actually the counterpart to this will be more close to, for every Tarskian logic, there is a possibly infinite class of sequent calculi such that an inference is valid in the logic if it's valid in all of the calculi. But then, of course, I'm sure that result is available, but then it probably begs the question of whether or not this is a calculus, right? Because calculus is something that you want to compute, to be able to check finitely, to have a finite set of rules and a proof. So here we get into more philosophical questions. Maybe some of you studied Gödel's incompleteness and Peano arithmetic and all these results, and well, there you get to same questions about, is it the same to be axiomatizable than to be finitely axiomatizable? Well, not necessarily, because what notion of proof we want? We want finite axiomatizability or axiomatizability in general. These are philosophical epistemological questions. Just wanted to mention them. We are going to move on to other stuff. Just wanted to mention this. Okay? Good. Now, two observations, right? Because we are approaching departure from the land of Tarskianity. Okay? So, first of all, if two logics are going to be different in terms of, okay, we have this logic, which is Tarskian, and this logic is a substructural version of that, or a non-Tarskian version of that, or a parastructural version of that, then they better be on the same language, right? Why do I mention this? Because maybe some of you, so here I'm going to make a parenthetical aside, okay? So if some of you read the literature on the ST and semantic paradoxes, maybe some of you know this, and if some of you didn't, no worries. So basically, what Pablo here and many of our esteemed colleagues also in Plexus did is they showed that actually you can have a theory of truth for paradoxes in a different logic that very much looks like classical logic, but it actually turns non-classical when you add something to the language. And that what you add to the language is basically a constant for the liar sentence. A sentence that says of itself, I am not true. Okay? So you're actually extending the language. So you are comparing a logic that doesn't have this with a logic that has this. Of course, maybe you can pivot this, the framing of this issue to to some case where you have the same language. And I think that actually you can, right? And we will discuss that later in other classes. But I just wanted to observe that for two things to be comparable in this respect, they need to share the logic that they are being compared with. Because otherwise, or there needs to be a translation from one to another and vice versa. Because otherwise, you are comparing things that is apple and oranges, okay? So that's just a very nuanced comment, and this is a course about nuances, so we are going to get into the subtleties. And then, for the important thing before going into non-Tarskianity, let's say that there are at least two main different ways of being non-Tarskian. One of them is to abandon the structural properties for other, which might be perhaps weaker. So for example, I don't know, let's look at the Tarskian properties, okay? Maybe, let's say, I don't want transitivity in general. I only want transitivity, like Hélène said, where this is finite. If this is infinite, I don't want it. Okay, maybe I want monotonicity, but only when this has certain relation to gamma. So it cannot be any delta. Just a delta that has some relation to gamma. What relation? I don't know. I will let you know later when I define my logic. Perhaps I want reflexivity, but only for logical expressions of this form. Which ones? The ones that I'm going to tell you later, okay? So maybe we want to restrict the properties in some way. That is definitely one way of having a relation, which we will glorify by saying it is a consequence relation, but it will be non-Tarskian, okay? So that is definitely one way. And the other way is by abandoning, or let's say, changing the relata of the consequence relation. So a relation is relating things, and these are called the relata of the relation, right? So the terms of the relation, say. So we have, in the case of Tarskian logics, and as Tarski defined it, and Elena mentioned this, we have sets. So sets have very distinct properties, okay? So here it says a relation from collections of formula. Collection is something which we don't know what it is. It's a bunch of things. What kind of bunch? Well, some bunches of things have some properties that others do not, right? So sets are collections of things which have two very important properties, right? Basically they are extensional. So they are defined by the things that are in them, and they don't care about repeating stuff or the order of stuff or whatever. So the set A, B is equal to the set A, B. Okay? And is equal to the set B, A. Right? And so on and so forth. So if we do that, then we are in the realm of Tarskianity. But if we change some of the terms, right, we might not. So if we, instead of working with sets A, B, we work with multisets, and we're going to note them with these square brackets, okay? These are sets where repetitions are important, right? So A, B is not the same as A, B, because this has two A's. But it is the same as A, B, A, because the order doesn't matter. We could be working with sequences, right? where we have things like A, comma B, comma A, and this is definitely not the same as A, comma B, because here A is before B, the two of them, and here one is before and one is after, okay? So we can also change that, and maybe we have lists where we care about the order, but we don't care about repetitions. And maybe here we care about the order and repetitions. But we can do a lot of stuff, right? And in some cases, in some instances, the fact that you take them into account directly affects the properties that you are having, and in some cases not, right? Because it might depend on how you formulate, for example, transitivity. You see, here you have collections. But in some cases, you have this formulated as that. But then, what is this relation? You need to establish that, okay? And that will affect, of course, whether or not this happens, okay? Good. So, at least two ways of being non-Tarskian. One way, change the relata. The other way, you tweak the properties. Sometimes you tweak the relata, you tweak the properties. Sometimes you tweak the relata, you don't tweak the properties. It might depend on how you formulate the properties, okay? And sometimes you tweak the properties, and given the relata that you have, like Ellen said, for example, you have sets, but you get rid of monotonicity. Well, in as much as you have sets, it's fine, because in this formulation of reflexivity, you already have monotonicity. See?
I think I don't see that there is like a very deep difference between being the entities of the relation or having such and such properties. So perhaps you can define your entities
See.
in a way that monotonicity is given for granted.
Right.
So I'm not sure. I kind of see that you want to give importance to this difference, but I'm not completely convinced that it is.
So you think that it's not so easy to differentiate these two ways?
I tend to think that so talking about sets is making implicit some properties that can appear explicit in your definition.
But how can you, for example, take relatas that force monotonicity?
I'm not sure.
No, but that's fine. Yeah.
Something like if something is in a set, then this set is equivalent to any superset, but not the other way. It's somehow.
You can take like a relata to be like upwards closed subsets of the language.
Right.
Something like this. Or upset closed sets of subsets of the language. But this, I mean, this is a little bit.
Because the comparison is when you look at the original LK, Gensen gives all these rules for exchange and contraction, etc. So one way of having these rules on board is implicitly saying, I'm talking about sets. But another way to look at the thing is, okay, you implicitly are forcing these properties on. So
I like it because I like it because say at least because of the following reason. It's usually said, and we will see that in the following classes, that these are sort of the main tenets of Tarskianity, or let's say structurality, in this sense of structurality, and that there are other structural properties which are actually entailed by the fact that you are working with sets or similar collections that are where order doesn't matter and repetition doesn't matter. So in a way, monotonicity will be is not entailed by that. That's more or less what you mean. And I like that's a point that hasn't been made. that there can be relata that where monotonicity is automatically implied. Because here, so people usually say, okay, the fact that they are sets doesn't entail monotonicity, and it appears that there is no relata that will entail monotonicity by itself. But if you can work with them, like classes,
I
right?
see that intuitively these properties are about the relation, the consequence relation. The other properties seem to be less connected to the consequence relation and more to the kind of entities. But the
Right.
fact is that you can encode these properties as a property of the consequence relation.
I like that. I think that discussing that, right?
It's more a philosophical point.
Sí, but I don't think it is inert. So I think that you have a point that this is a distinction and a discussion that we can have, and we can write about that and discuss and analyze that, because, see, for example, this is just an asterisk, okay? Many of you perhaps are familiar with the literature on paradoxes and stuff. So when you derive a paradox, you need to use that rule or this rule, and actually there are many ways of deriving paradoxes. So some people say like, see, this is the culprit of the paradox because you are always using that rule. And interestingly, some other people say like, actually that's only because you are approaching the problem from this point of view. If you rephrase the derivation from the point of view of that, you can see that maybe you need this, maybe you need that. So actually, they are not independent choices. So basically what I see that you're saying is that it looks like they are independent choices. Relata, properties. But you can have relata that induce properties,
Yeah.
and properties that disregard the nuances of the relata, because anyway the same relations will be induced. So I think that there is a point there, Pablo. Let's keep looking at that. Yes.
A related question maybe. So we're not assuming that the left side of the sequence is a set, but we have some set theoretic notation in the
Exactly.
conditions. So
Yes.
is there, I mean, for multisets, sure, you can talk about subset and element. Is there a clear also analog for lists and?
Yes. For lists, I don't know, but there is a sub part of the substructural literature that maybe I will put in the slides after. That is by Francesco Paoli and Cintula, and Peter Cintula, and also in discussion with Ripley. They discuss whether or not, when you have multisets, remember they care about repetitions, whether or not just working with multisets entails that you have a non-Tarskian, in a way, a non-Tarskian relation. And Dave says like, you will end up with a Tarskian relation anyway because of the involvement of the set theoretic operations. And then Peter and Francesco say like, yes, that is true. So the way to go is to also have an involved approach to that and to the commas and etc. Right? So you can look at that as saying, they warned us about the fact that only adopting multisets will not take you outside of Tarskianity. You need to be more careful in all of the signs that appear here, exactly like the commas, the thing, everything, for you to induce a multiset consequence relation and not a set consequence relation. So yes, and I will add that to the. I think one of the papers is called like, is multiset consequence relation trivial or something like that, and they have this discussion. So let's do a brief overview about non-Tarskian logics and substructural logics. We'll see, of course, in detail these things in the upcoming classes. We just wanted to, flag them and get you acquainted with them. Okay, so why would someone want to reason with collections of formulas other than sets? Why? Well, let's discuss it briefly. And why would someone want a notion of logical consequence that is not closed under these properties? Okay, so it's non-Tarskian. So let's see exactly what we mean by that. So why will you accept something like phi, phi? So two copies of phi imply chi, but not one copy of phi implies chi. I think I put that in the references, but people from the paradoxes literature and the philosophical literature will know that there are some discussions of the semantic paradoxes here, where, for example, the liar sentence is a representation of an unstable state of affairs, and that state of affairs on its own does not imply a contradiction, but only, let's say, two instances of that, where one instance represents the liar being true and the other being false. So this has been put forward by Elias Ardini, now in Madrid and other places. Of course, there's also people from the, well, it might be philosophical, but also the more computer side of things. You evaluate validity as being an implementation of resources, right? So sometimes you need two resources to get something, but only one of them will not get you there. So say one of them, this position is like, I have €1 and I can get something here that costs €2. So actually you need two copies of I have €1 and then I have another euro and then I can get that. Of course, for me that's, there is an issue of formalization there, but anyways, these are some ways in which some people might motivate that.
That would be me. I don't see any problem with formalization of this.
Okay,
So
good.
if you want to buy 2 coffees and each
Sí.
coffee costs
One
1,
coin.
as you said,
Sí.
you need 2 coins, right?
Right.
So what's the problem?
But the problem is that I will take, so what is valid is that if I have, so I have €2, is a different phi. It's not a phi, it's a psi, say. So phi is, it's not the fact that I have €1 and I have €1. They are not two different things. It's that you have €2. It's a different proposition.
Yeah, I understand. So maybe if I say I have €1 and I have €1 and I have €1, yeah, you only have €1. You can say it as many times as you want, but you still only have €1 at the end of the day.
That might be an issue of formalization. Of course, it is a conceptual thing, right? Because
Depends-
formalization.
Depends what you call and. So if
Sí,
you go to
exactly.
natural language,
Exactly.
then yes, but
Sí.
no, but the formalization that you're going
But
to
you don't
use.
say and there, it's just I have €1, I have €1, I have €1, I have €1. Okay.
Yes, but then you sum up in a pi or something like this.
Sí, sí,
So it depends on the meta language that you have, right? You're assuming that you have classical kind of reasoning language, If I assume that I have a different language, then this is not going to be the same.
Right.
Yeah.
So these discussions and these cases are super good motivations for, let's say, some people that really want to have a non-contractive, or that even think that our reasoning might be non-contractive, or at least for some context where we want to use this kind of reasoning that Elaine is very kindly putting forward. This require for you to not accept contraction always, because these things happen. Yes, of.
Kind of similar questions, though slightly different. Sometimes proofs like to count the instances of rules they
Totally.
provide, right?
Totally.
Would it be part of the notion of Tarskianity if you had, the Tarskian properties, but you've got restrictions of applications? So you say per proof you're only allowed to use 2 contractions,
Yep.
3 instances of monotonicity, and I don't know, 1 cut.
Absolutely.
And that's all you're allowed to use. Would that still be Tarskian, or would that also? Because you get things that look substructural
Right.
out of that, but the properties are still Tarskian. All you do is count.
Right. So that is another issue, or that gets into another issue, which is, for example, where are you counting, right? So perhaps you're counting within a calculus, or perhaps you're counting within an algorithm, right? So the question will be, how do you associate that framework that you're using to induce a logic, which is rather an abstract entity, how you're using that framework to induce a logic, and then to know how that instrument, to know whether the logic that instrument induces in the way that you chose is Tarskian or not. This is exactly the discussion of whether or not substructural logics are non-Tarskian logic. This is exactly that. And you couldn't have described it more accurately. And we'll see it tomorrow. Because tomorrow my first push will be substructural logics are not the things that some of the philosophers think they are. Okay? At least the philosophers that I've come across in this project. Okay? And that's where we need to shift to some other terminology, right? Because we're not talking about substructural logics in the same sense in which our friends in the computer mathematical community are talking about it. We're talking about the differences. But for now, we're here, right? So why would you want that? Because of the issues that we mentioned. Why would you not want monotonicity? If something is valid, just enlarging your set of assumptions, why would it contravene the things that you already established? And there are a lot of reasons here. One of them, also very well known in the philosophical and mathematics community, is the... No. I like my grass also very...
For the mate.
Yeah. Sí. Okay, so one motivation for non-monotonicity is what we call diffeasible reasoning, okay? So basically, the fact that by adding additional assumptions, maybe you are countering something that you already assumed, so actually it's not that you can entail the same things that you did before, but the new information defies that, so you better pull back a little bit, okay? So that might be one instance, but there might be other instances. And for example, one that is very keen to me and some of my colleagues is you might think that logical validity has something to do with content analysis or content inclusion, okay? So you might say, chi here is included in the content of phi. That's why I can logically establish it. But if you enlarge the set of assumptions that you are doing, it's not really included in the content of any psi, right? And maybe I am requiring that for it to be valid, it needs to be included in all of the premises, not just some of them, and you just throw redundant stuff around. So here, for example, Agus and Martin and other people, they've been working in content inclusion logics, and some of them are non-monotonic, right? Of course, you can then have counter-arguments to this and see, no, okay, you're not doing fine with this notion, you have to have another one. Why no transitivity? Okay, so again, the people that working in vagueness and in parameters of vagueness, or also in some thing that we might call plausible reasoning, okay, is that reasoning where you say, I want to go from premises that are super strong or that are as strong as this threshold to conclusions which are perhaps a little bit weaker but still plausible enough, okay? And then you can concatenate that and see that you are actually approaching the degrees of similarity to a certain notion of truthfulness or validity, okay? And you can go from things which are fine to things which are less fine but anyways acceptable. And here you can do well just because you're not contravening anything. So you're going from something which is weaker to something that is super weak. But since this doesn't satisfy the requirement of being strong, you're actually not violating anything. And when you concatenate everything, you're going from something strong to something which is super weak. This is the non-transitivity of a relation is a very essential property of the similarity relations. Okay, similarity relations are non-transitive. You may know this from family reunions. Okay, you might be very much like a relative of yours, and they might be similar to others, but you are not similar to the third person. Okay, And this has importations in the case of semantic properties and so on. And finally, these are all examples. There are many more motivations for this. And finally, why non-reflexivity? Okay, some of you working in the literature of paradoxes may know this, that there are some instances of this stuff, but I wanted to bring you another one, which is more close to the philosophical tradition, regardless of paradoxes, okay, which is connected to more, let's say, antique or medieval themes, okay? So, if you don't, be sure to check the literature on an account of negation, which is called negation as cancellation. So basically what this account says is that negating something is as scratching it or erasing it from existence, meaning an speech act, okay? So here having phi and having not phi, it's just like having said nothing, okay? It's not saying two things, it's saying one and taking it back, okay? So basically, what this says is that contradictory statements don't have content, right? Or are not asserting anything. And if they are not asserting anything, and we have a notion of entailment which is connected to content, right? Inclusion or analysis or something like that, then contradictory premises do not have content to analyze. So they cannot entail anything. In particular, they cannot even entail themselves. So for gamma and phi contingent, let's do that for contingent, or let's say at least plausibly satisfiable formulas, everything that you know is fine. But if you have contradictory, then that is not fine. So in particular, phi and not phi does not entail phi and not phi, okay? So that notion of negation as cancellation is non-reflexive. Of course, it's also non-monotonic, right? Because you may have phi entails phi, in particular, a super intuitive instance, P therefore P, but P, not P, that's not valid, okay? So monotonicity is also not valid there. Anyways, these are all only examples, so let's move on. So what I wanted to point out here with regards to non-Tarskianity is that the non is very actual, talking about modalities, right, and time. So the non in non-Tarskian says that there are witnesses to the non-Tarskianity of the logic. So there are instances of particular formulas where the properties are not being respected, that show the non-closure of the logic under these properties. For example, here, phi and not phi is an example of non-reflexivity, right? So phi and not phi is not entailed by phi and not phi, okay? And again, for other cases, in some other logics, okay? Good. So now let's go briefly to substructural logics, and I think that more or less this will be my last thing that I will mention. I have some time more, so maybe we can go into some details here. So substructural logics, we have already discussed them in the previous presentation, and we will, of course, in the next days, are very much connected to sequent calculus, okay? So sequent calculus originates with the work of Gensen, and it can be as a form of an axiomatic calculus, actually, right? What do I mean by this? That axioms have the form of sequence, and you actually manipulate sequence. So the formulas of this calculus are sequence, right? And you move from set of sequence to sequence. These sequence, you usually write them like this. You can also write them with other symbols, with the turnstile. You can write them with two dots. You can write them with this. You can do whatever you want, okay? It's only a terminological difference. And they usually count with rules that go from sets of sequence to a single sequence, okay? And notice, again, the asymmetry, right? Here you go from many to one. there are two different sorts of rules. I assume that many of you know this, but some of you may not. The ones that we call structural and the ones that we call operational. And basically, the structural ones do not mention logical expressions at all. The operational do. Okay? Good. So, this is already mentioned. So, almost always, these calculi, right, count with axiomatic sequence that only have one form. Almost always. Of course, not always, but almost always. And they codify, let's say, some sort of identity or reflexivity in the form of phi, therefore phi, or phi arrow phi, or p, therefore p, for all propositional letters p, or even some forms where you have context, gamma and delta to the right or left, right? This leads to interpretation, which I'm going to question, of whether or not this is actually a presentation of the structural property of reflexivity, right? So whether or not calculi that don't have this are representations for non-Tarskian logics. Next class I'm going to challenge that and I will show you why, okay? Why substructural logics are not non-Tarskian logics. And other important rules, of course, you may know them, weakening or thinning, sometimes called. They encode supposedly monotonicity, and different forms of the cut rule, they encode transitivity. I think I have them here, right? So, of course, they are not all the forms that you can have of these rules. This is a form of identity for arbitrary formulas. These are forms of monotonicity or weakening to the left and right only for one formula. You can have them for sets sometimes. And here is a form of the transit of one cut rule, supposedly encoding transitivity, which we call additive cut, because the context in this premise and this premise are the same. So gamma and delta are both here and here, but they can be different. We can have gamma delta and here sigma p, for example. And here we will have gamma sigma delta p. And we can have also different versions. Gensen has one rule which is called mix, which mix a little bit of additive, a little bit of multiplicative, okay? So you can have a lot of stuff. Proofs are very dependent sometimes on some of the properties, and properties of the calculus and the logic associated also sometimes are dependent on those, okay? And there are other structural rules. The ones that I would like to mention here are the contraction rules, right? Which will lead you from at least two appearances to a single one, and you can have different forms, the contraction rules. For example, you can do with however many occurrences to only one, or however many to however many but less, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there are different formulations, and these will play into exactly what you're getting when you're getting at that. Okay. Again, why would someone want to reason within a calculus where some of these structural rules are absent? Well, of course, we, again, reason about that, and we mention, like, why would someone not want this? But actually, we will see tomorrow that it's not the same to reason within a sequent calculus that doesn't have this rule than to have a non-Tarskian logic. So maybe you take your calculus as being a representation of something else and not a calculus of logical consequences, and then it's fine to get rid of this, but to maintain the Tarskian properties. And we will see that actually you can do that, and actually that's how usually things are done, right? As opposed to what some folks in the philosophical literature tend to assume, okay? So, in saying that, let me also mention a brief thing that I think I can mention in connection to that. So, the operational rules, Elaine mentioned that. And you saw some of them, have also, so here we have this cut, we can call it cut A for cut additive. And I mentioned that you have the other cut, which is the multiplicative cut from sigma to P, right? And we call this cut M, and here you have gamma sigma delta P, okay? Why we call this, perhaps some of you are familiar with this, I'm sorry if I'm repeating, perhaps some of you don't. I hope this helps you and is educative in some form. So when we have two premise rules, for example cut is a two premise rule, we call them additive if the contexts are the same, multiplicative if they can be different. Not necessarily that they are different, that they can be different. And for one premise rules, let's here have an occasion for conjunction on the left, right? Well, let's do this the proper way. We call them, now we are into operational rules. This is structural, this is operational because we have conjunction here. For one premise rules, we call them additive if they have a certain property and multiplicative if they have a certain other property. And let me show you what I mean by that. So there are many different, say, terminologies for this. All of them are equivalent. We call the formula being introduced here the principal formula. And we call the subformulas of these auxiliary formulas, right? Here. And we call the rest context. So the multiplicative rules, call them left conjunction, multiplicative, and left conjunction additive, okay? And of course here you have the other one with side, okay? Good. Left conjunction additive 1 and 2. So the multiplicatives are the ones where each subformula of the principal formula appears as an auxiliary formula here. And the additive ones do not require that, okay? This is for the single premise rules, right? So why would you want, or what happens when you dispense with some of the structural properties like this, or contraction, right? Or contraction? It happens that the two premise rules, like cut, and of course the ones for conjunction and disjunction, let me just show you the one for conjunction, which is super intuitive in both cases, right? So if we have that both things are true, we have that the conjunction is, but this is the right additive because contexts are the same. But let's do for the right multiplicative, we have sigma P and then gamma sigma. Good. So here is the right. Okay, so what we have is that if we abandon either weakening or cut or contraction, sorry, or if we restrict them, these notions that will otherwise all be the same come apart. Okay, the conjunction, if we have the additive and the multiplicative conjunction, the additive and the multiplicative disjunction, conditional, whatever. If we have contraction and weakening and the rest, they are all the same. If we don't have some of them, they come apart. So a little exercise, if you want, for tomorrow, because I don't think that we have time today, is prove that all of them are interderivable, okay? So if you have contraction and weakening, you can assume the premises of each of these rules, and using the other rules and the structural properties, structural rules, you can derive the consequences of the other, okay? And that's very useful and very interesting, okay? So another thing that this sort of surfaces is what Elaine was replying to Xavi, which is, what is the conjunction that you're using? When you say, I have €1 and I have €1 and I have €1. If you want to be resource conscious, you don't want to use the one which can just add stuff regardless, and it only cares about truth. You want to use the one that counts, right? Counts appearances as different. So that's why that's another way in which you can see that if you lose contraction, you can count in two different ways. Or you can conjunct in two different ways and disjunct in two different ways, and also imply in terms of a conditional in two different ways. But just keep in mind one other thing that we will see in some classes is that you can also mix them. You can just go to a supermarket and take one of these and one of that, okay? And you will find yourself in special situations where maybe you don't have some of those, but in having one of these and one of that, or the other way around, you will be able to recover them, okay? Be it for contraction or for weakening, right? So maybe some of the rules are absent, but not really, right? Because they can be present in different ways. And we will talk about ways of being present and ways of being absent in a calculus, okay? So let's say just an exercise for some of you that may not have done this, the students, check that the additive and the multiplicative are interderivable given weakening and cut and the other stuff. It doesn't take you much time. And also check what happens with regard to weakening. And so consider a calculus where you don't have weakening and you don't have contraction, but you have one to the left additive and to the right multiplicative, or the other way around, to the left multiplicative, to the right additive, and see if you can derive some of these, what happens, right? And in which situations do you end up? Okay, so that being said, I think I'm just about to finish. I have, I think, one slide more. So I was here. So this is our question. Like, what? Okay, we want to go non-Tarskian. We want to diverge from Tarskian logics. One way is being non-Tarskian, like in this very, say, conceptual, philosophical manner: negation, cancellation, content inclusion, resource consciousness, diffusible reasoning, whatever. The other way is like, no, let me see. I have a calculus. I will just extract this rule. I am being non-Tarskian. Why? Well, because I want to have two different ways of conjunction. Okay, good. Then the question is, this thing that I have ended up with, which is a substructural logic, is really a calculus for a non-Tarskian logic? Because it looks like it. Because I have extracted some rules which codify a Tarskian property, apparently, supposedly, allegedly. So am I really going non-Tarskian here, right? This heavily depends on what we mean by a rule being absent from a calculus, and more than anything, what do we mean by a sequent calculus being a calculus for a logic, right? And this depends on how we associate calculus with a logic, which has a lot of connections with what are we trying to do when we prove completeness proof, when we do reduction trees, when we do soundness proofs, etc. and etc., right? When we try to build maximal sets that have this and that property, because we are trying to connect this calculus with this logic, independently considered, okay? These questions, I think, that are in the core of the difference that I presented today, right? That I want to discuss in the following classes, and I think need a little bit of nuance and subtleties. Okay. That being said, I think I made it to the time that Isa's going to ask me. So we will start answering this question tomorrow. So thank you. Let's just have some. Thank you.